I used to love sharing the minimal facts argument with unbelievers. It's easy to present in a few minutes and sounds rhetorically powerful. When I could tell my friends that the facts that I'm sharing are universally acknowledged by scholars, even those who are skeptical, it seems like I'm not coming at them with something that only conservative evangelicals believe. And on the surface at least, taking an end run around the Gospels seemed helpful because unbelievers tend to view them as dubious sources. However, there were a couple of issues that I ran into. One was very practical. Let's say that I got a skeptic to actually hear me out. Does it really make sense for me to say, okay, well, I granted for the sake of argument that the Gospels are a hot mess of contradictions and historical gaffes, but now I want to take that back and argue that they're much more reliable than that. You should accept Orthodox Christian doctrine. The skeptic might be thinking, if that were true, why didn't you just start out with that? Why did you grant so much for the sake of argument? It feels a whole lot like bait and switch. Plus, once an objection like grief hallucinations or mass delusions came up, I'd eventually have to back up and present other facts that skeptical and liberal scholars didn't acknowledge. So any imagined rhetorical advantage simply evaporated. This approach really didn't end up being the time saver that it was advertised to be. If I really wanted to defend bodily appearances or the empty tomb or the early persecution of the 12, I simply just couldn't do it all with Paul. I'd have to learn to defend the reliability of the Gospels and Acts. There just are no shortcuts. Now, the good news is that this can be extremely rewarding and faith-building. You won't be at a loss for words when you hear a scholarly critic like Bart Ehrman lay out a list of complaints about the Gospels. You'll no longer have to console yourself with the thought of, well, I'm not so sure how to answer that, but at least the core facts are true. You could read the Gospels and not wonder, is this part really defensively historical? Learning this approach kills cognitive dissonance. Now, there is one drawback. You're going to be told that you hold some fringy views, but again, saying that there is evidence for the empty tomb or the resurrection appearances being physical is already considered fringy to many in the scholarly world anyways. And importantly, scholarly politics can't trump the force of objective evidence. It doesn't mean that something is weakly supported by non-question begging evidence because it isn't granted by skeptical and liberal scholars, nor does it mean that we're making a "for the Bible tells me so" argument. Now, you might be afraid, what if the skeptic just jumps out with, what about all the contradictions? What do I do then? Well, here's what you can do. You can offer to revisit them later and continue to make your positive case rather than just conceding them all for the sake of argument. And by the way, the robust reliability argument for the resurrection can also be made in a way that's just as quick and easy to share as minimal facts. It goes something like this. Either the disciples were deceivers, deceived, or they were telling the truth. They were not deceivers, for they had good reasons not to lie, considering they'd be ostracized and persecuted. They were not merely mistaken or deceived themselves, and we can tell this by the accounts they gave of seeing, touching, and talking with the risen Jesus over a long period of time. Therefore, they were telling the truth. That's not so hard now, is it? You can make this argument on an elevator. You just need to be prepared to back it up with additional evidence. So with all that in mind, I'm going to tell you about 3 modern books that you can pick up for around $50 total. And then I'm going to give you 3 older public domain books that you can get off the Google Play Store that won't cost you a dime. Resource number 1, The Case for Jesus by Dr. Brant Petra. This book helps answer a whole host of questions. Were the 4 Gospels really anonymous? Aren't they written far too late to be considered reliable? Aren't the Gospels folklore and not actually biography? What about the lost Gospels like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Peter? Is Jesus only divine in the Gospel of John and not the Synoptics? Peter offers some neglected evidence from the early church fathers and ancient manuscripts to demonstrate that the Gospels are not anonymous as skeptics love to assert. Furthermore, he puts Jesus of Nazareth's divine claims in an ancient Jewish context in a way that blew my mind. You won't look at phrases like Son of Man or Kingdom of God in the same way. Resource number 2, Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams. This is a super accessible book. It's only 140 pages. The whole thing is great, but I have to say chapter 3 is worth the price of the book alone. Skeptics often claim that the Gospels were written decades later by people unfamiliar with first century Palestine. Well, if that's true, we'd expect to find all kinds of errors regarding Palestinian geography, names, and customs, but Williams demonstrates time after time that the Gospel writers get these little details right. Based on this data, Williams concludes that, quote, the resulting Gospels are not what we would expect from people who made up stories at a geographical distance, unquote. This serves as evidence that the evangelists were well-informed, consistently trustworthy, and close up to the facts. I actually already made a couple of videos on this topic, drawing from Williams's book, that are in the description. Resource number 3, Hidden in Plain View by Lydia McGrew. Having been largely neglected for over a century, Lydia McGrew revives an argument for the reliability of the New Testament called Undesigned coincidences. In a nutshell, an undesigned coincidence is an apparently casual yet puzzle-like fit between two or more texts, and its best explanation is that the authors knew the truth about the events they describe or allude to. These connections are among passages in the Gospels, as well as between Acts and Paul's epistles. These lend credence to the idea that the documents were written by eyewitnesses who knew what they were talking about. And this is absolutely relevant to developing a case for the resurrection, because if the Gospels can be shown to be rooted in credible eyewitness testimony, then you have to take seriously the reported nature and variety of the post-resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus as coming from the original eyewitnesses. I've already made a couple of videos on this topic that you can find in the description. Seeing examples of this in action is by far the easiest way to understand it. You can also find plenty of interviews and lectures on YouTube where Dr. McGrew shares this argument in depth. I'd also highly recommend her other 2 books if you're interested in learning more about the reliability of the Gospels. Those books are The Eye of the Beholder, which is a very good defense of John's Gospel, and The Mirror or the Mask, which argues against claims made by evangelical scholars that the Gospel authors felt free to present events in one way, even when they knew in reality that the events were quite different. These are a little more technical than her first book, but they are a great place to start if you want to go deeper into the issues. Okay, now for the free resources. J.J. Blunt's book Undesigned Coincidences and William Paley's Horae Paulinae are the non-updated version of Lydia's. I still recommend that you get her book because she picks the best of these undesigned coincidences, and she's also discovered several more that are not in the older books. But if you're on a budget, these are great additions to your library, and even if you're not on a budget, get them anyway. Both of these books are still very much worth reading, even after reading Hidden in Plain View. Finally, get a view of the evidences of Christianity by William Paley. I cannot recommend this book enough. Paley debunks Hume's anti-miracle argument, and he examines all the evidence that the original witnesses of Christianity were willing to undergo labors, dangers, and suffering in order to spread the gospel of the resurrection. Paley also goes into great detail regarding the authorship and early use of the Gospels, which includes the unanimous testimony of the early church and even some heretics. Paley also takes into consideration the unity of the character of Christ in all 4 Gospels. This answers some of the why is John's Jesus so different objections. Paley also demonstrates 41 instances where the Gospel writers make incidental allusions to history that can be confirmed outside the New Testament, even down to minor details. Again, these illustrate the evangelists' familiarity with the setting and their accuracy in recounting details. Paley discusses alleged discrepancies in the Gospels, talks about prophecy, and so much more. I really just can't do this book justice in a short video. Just get it. Sure, his style of writing is from the 18th century, and his arguments could use a few minor updates. However, this book has stood the test of time for the most part and should absolutely not be forgotten. As I said, there are many other books I'd recommend, and I'll list several in the description down below. I just want to assure you that this isn't as difficult to learn as you might think. It took time to learn the minimal facts approach. You could take time to learn this. There may be some extra details, sure, but we've seen that the extra details are necessary to make a strong case. And we can all find less time for Twitter, Instagram, or reading the latest political news, or binge watching Netflix. You just have to set the right priorities. Skeptics have poked apart the minimalist approach to the resurrection for far too long. We need an army of Christian apologists who can make a more robust case. You can do this.